Welcome back to the Bible in Context,
where context is king and the original author's intent is what drives our interpretation.
Yep, and today we're going to be talking about the book of Exodus, and thankfully we have Dr. Carmen Imes here with us to walk us through just an overview of the book of Exodus since we are making our way out of the book of Genesis now. She is a great candidate to give us an overview of this book. She's put a lot of work into this book. Starting out, many of you may have heard of her first couple of works in the series, Bearing God's Name and Being God's Image. Fantastic books that gives us the significance of Sinai and what it means to bear God's name. And there's going to be a third book in this series coming along as well, from what I understand. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Oh, awesome. You've got covers for it.
I matched the cover today. That's really great. The third book is coming out this fall. It's called Becoming God's Family, Why the Church Still Matters. And I'm tracing the theme through scripture of the community of God gathered around the presence of God and trying to make the case for why it matters that we gather together to worship, not just try to kind of go our own way and follow Jesus.
Yeah, that's going to be a great resource. I'm actually had quite a few, I feel like, conversations recently where I wish I had that book to hand out because it's so often that you hear, well, all I need is me and Jesus. I don't understand why do I need the body of Christ as well? So we won't get off and make a whole episode about that, even though I kind of wish we could. We'll just get to Exodus. But primarily, you've also been working on an Exodus commentary for quite a while now, coming out with the Baker commentary for the Old Testament series. And along with that, something I've loved about what you're doing is you've been trying to popularize your research through Torah Tuesday videos. You have on YouTube a series called Torah Tuesday, where you've been just walking your audience just step by step, just a few verses at a time, walking them through the Exodus, literary structures, the Hebrew, the significance of how the passage may play into the larger story. So again, really appreciated that. And so a large part of what we wanted to have you on for was to point people in the direction of the podcast that you have going on with Torah Tuesday, along with your other works, because we don't want to, as we're coming out of Genesis, try to do something that you're already doing so well. So I'd rather just say when we get to Exodus, just go listen to Carmen Imes. She's got that territory figured out.
It's different, like walking through the text of Exodus verse by verse. And it's taken me, this is my 5th year working on the commentary, and that's how long the channel's been going. And there's over 125 videos on Exodus. So that's useful for some venues. If you're wondering what to do with Exodus 21 verses 22 through 25, there's a video on that. But if you're wanting bigger themes of the book, then something like this is more helpful. So I'm glad we're talking about kind of big picture stuff today.
For sure. Well, I wanted to ask, just before we got going here, was what really led you to be so interested in the book of Exodus?
So I kind of landed on a dissertation topic on the 10 Commandments, and I did not set out intending to do that. I really wanted to do something in the prophets. And as I was pitching ideas to my eventual doctoral advisor, Dan Block, none of my ideas were sticking. He kept saying, oh, that sounds like a great sermon, or that sounds like a great, Bible study series, but that's not really a dissertation. So finally, I just asked him, okay, so you're nearing retirement. What are some topics you think still need to be done? Like I didn't feel like I was in a great position to know what scholarship hadn't been done yet. I mean, there's like a lot of books that have already been written on the Old Testament, and I have not read them all. And so I felt like he'd be in a better position than I was to know what work needed to be done. And he was kind enough to send me a list of topics, including the command not to take the Lord's name in vain, which he said had been grossly misunderstood and needed a re-examination. So that kicked off my work on Exodus. I've published the dissertation as Bearing Yahweh's Name at Sinai, a re-examination of the name command of the Decalogue, and then Bearing God's Name was a popularization of what I learned in that study. So after finishing the dissertation, and actually as I was beginning work, I had just finished work on Bearing God's Name when I got the invitation to write the Exodus commentary for Baker Academic. And I realized what a gift it would be to work on it, because I had gone really deep on one verse, which I did some contextual work in Exodus, but I literally spent 5 years trying to understand one verse. And I knew that there was so much more in Exodus to be learned. And so the idea of being able to broaden out and still give close attention to the whole book, but not quite as deep a dive on every verse as what I did for the dissertation, I just knew it would be rich. And wow, it is like my favorite thing to do is to work on this commentary, because I feel like I'm learning stuff every single day that is useful. And then I go back through my own commentary notes to remember stuff that I can't hold all in my head at once. So I feel like I'm creating a resource. It's like doing an in-depth Bible study and creating a resource that you can keep coming back to again and again for the rest of your life.
No, it really is. Because I mean, at the end of every video, you have a little bit of practicality at the end of it too. So it's a lot of applied knowledge as well as bringing out the technical resources. So I'm glad you're doing it, and I'm also glad you're not spending 5 years in every verse so that we can get the commentary sometime in the next 90 years.
Right. Yeah. The commentary will be about 250,000 words, which is almost triple the length of the dissertation. But I've got to cover the entire book, all 40 chapters, so I can't go quite as deep. But that means it's less tedious, and I can focus in on the things that just I find most interesting or inspiring. So it's been a lot of fun.
Very cool. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast with us today. And I'm a huge fan of your work, and I've really enjoyed some of the classes that you've done for the Bible Project on Exodus. And unfortunately, your class came out right after I finished walking through Exodus, preaching through Exodus.
Bummer.
So I would walk through things and say, oh, why didn't I say that? But it's been really helpful. It's been good. It's been good. So we wanted to start off today just by asking you kind of a big picture kind of question and talk about Exodus in general as we're coming out of Genesis. What are your feelings towards the main tensions and maybe lingering questions that the original readers might have been wrestling with as we get into Exodus? And then also, what do you feel like the role of the book of Exodus is? What role does it play in the Torah? I guess in other words, what's the purpose of the book? And then finally, maybe you can give us a sense of the flow of the book, the high points, kind of a general outline.
Sure. So I think the first thing to say is that there's this really significant moment in Genesis where God makes a covenant with Abraham, promises that he'll have many descendants and that he'll be a blessing to all nations and that they'll own the land, that they'll take possession of the land of Canaan. But the book of Genesis ends with the people having moved down to Egypt. The family of Abraham is now in Egypt because of the famine in Canaan. And so there's this sense of something's not right. God said he'd give them Canaan. That hasn't happened yet. The tension between Joseph and his brothers have been resolved. And so they're kind of like safe for now in Egypt and finding food. But there's this sense they don't belong here and they need to get out. And that sets us up for the book of Exodus, which starts with the word "and" in Hebrew. The first word of Exodus is, "And these are the names of the sons of Israel who went to Egypt with Jacob." And then it gives a list of the 12 sons of Jacob. And I think the first thing that I was struck by as I studied chapter 1 is the way that Joseph's solution to the problem of the famine in Egypt actually created the conditions which allowed for the oppression of the Hebrews in Exodus. And so the giving over to Pharaoh of all the land and then all the labor of the people actually sets us up for the exploitation that happens in Exodus, which just to me illustrates the importance of having godly leadership, ethical leadership, because if we don't have leaders who are committed to providing for human flourishing, then exploitation happens instead. And so the book opens with the people having multiplied and become numerous. Lots of echoes of Genesis 1, where God says to be fruitful and multiply, and that's happening in Exodus chapter 1, but rather than subduing the earth, they're being subdued by other people, which was never God's intention. So the book of Exodus opens with a major problem, the oppression of the Israelites, and we watch through the book as God sets them free from Pharaoh. And I think sometimes people assume that this is the book about liberation, just kind of now you can go do whatever you want with your life. But actually, Exodus, one of the key themes of the book is that they're going from serving Pharaoh to serving Yahweh. So rather than ushering them into freedom, they're actually experiencing a change in master, going from Pharaoh to Yahweh. And the purpose of coming out of Egypt is to have the freedom to worship and serve Yahweh. And we find over and over again that he is a radically different master than Pharaoh was, that he creates the conditions for human flourishing, and that he invites his people into the vocation of representing him among the nations. So the book of Exodus unfolds the identity of the people of Israel and their vocation as his representatives. And it ends, of course, at Sinai. The second half of the book is at Sinai with the giving of the law and the building of the tabernacle so that the presence of God can come down from the mountain. It's like God moves into the neighborhood and travels forward with the people from Sinai. So the presence of God is a huge theme in the book. The revelation of God's name, his power, his superiority to Pharaoh and the gods of Egypt, his goodness in distinction from other ancient Near Eastern cultures and contexts. And all of that, I mean, it's such a rich study because there are so many contextual, cultural, historical factors that make God amazing in Exodus. But then there's all these linguistic and literary design factors. Like Exodus is a very well told story. And so there's all sorts of brilliant literary strategies. And then these key theological themes emerge along the way. So it's just a rich feast for anyone who wants to slow down and take the time to read it well.
Oh, thanks. That's a great summary. One of the passages in chapter 4, I think, is maybe one of the strangest passages that you come across in all of Scripture, really. And let me just read it to you. So the context of this, of course, is Moses is on his way to Egypt, and I would love to just get your thoughts on this and help us understand it and the significance of this passage. But I'm going to read verses 24 through 26. This is in the ESV. So at a lodging place on the way, the Lord met him and sought to put him to death. Then Zipporah took a flint and cut off her son's foreskin and touched Moses' feet with it and said, "Surely you are a bridegroom of blood to me." So he let him alone. It was then that she said, "A bridegroom of blood," because of the circumcision. All right, so help us understand that crazy passage.
I asked on the app formerly known as Twitter the other day what people wanted me to talk about in the commentary. Like, what questions did they hope I would answer? And this far and away got the most comments. So many people wondering, what in the world do we do with Exodus chapter 4? Particularly because it's jarring because God has just told Moses to go back to Egypt to deliver the people. And Moses is in the process of obeying, and God tries to kill him. So you have the problem of, like, why is God trying to kill him? And then why is God trying to kill him here in this moment when he's in the process of obeying? So yes, it's a tricky one. I have become convinced that this story is absolutely crucial to the plot of Exodus. That it's not just a vestige of old stories that they felt like they had to include because it was, had been passed down. But that structurally and literarily it's really important. Thematically it's really important. And that we can't really understand it without reading the whole context from 18 to 31 because there are like 7 micro scenes in a row in those verses, and all of them have links with each other. There's all these repeated words that like tie the little scenes together. And then this whole block of verses in chapter 4 has all sorts of connections with chapter 18 and ties between them. I don't know if it's from every one of the 7 scenes, but most of them have ties to chapter 18. So what I didn't say earlier about the structure of Exodus comes into play here, and that is there really are 2 rescue stories in the book of Exodus. First is the rescue of Moses, and then the rescue of the nation of Israel. And there are all kinds of parallels between the 2 rescue stories. So this incident with Zipporah in chapter 4 forms the end of the Moses rescue story. She takes her place along with all the women of chapter 1 and 2 who saved Moses' life. The midwives, the daughter of Pharaoh, the daughter of Levi, his sister, all these women who conspire against Pharaoh and defy his orders and save Moses instead of putting him to death. They act in ways that prefigure what Yahweh is going to do to defy Pharaoh and save the entire nation. And there's all kinds of verbal links between them. The daughter of Pharaoh saw the basket. She heard him crying. She felt compassion for him. She's sent to get the basket. She felt compassion for him and she saves him. And in a similar way, Yahweh saw the oppression of the Israelites. He heard them crying out in their slavery. He felt sorry for them and he sent Moses to bring them out. So there's all kinds of resonance there. But back to chapter 4, one thing that I've noticed is that Zipporah gets a bad rap, as some people actually talk about her as causing the problem. Like, she is the reason why Moses hasn't circumcised his sons, because she's been resistant to it. And they read that into it because they read a certain tone into her words. Surely you're a bridegroom of blood to me. As if it's like she's just like spitting, like, oh, I can't believe I had to do this. You made me do this. And like she's really disgusted, rather than reading that as the pronouncement that must be made to make the ritual effective. She is a ritual practitioner. She's doing what priests do, and she somehow knows what's called for in this situation, and she knows what to say to put it into effect. Kind of like the moment in a wedding when the officiant says, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Like that's the moment where they're actually married, where the rest of the ritual ceremony kind of comes into effect. And so I think when she says, surely you're a bridegroom of blood to me, she's saying the thing that needs to be said to resolve the problem. And what is the problem? The problem is that Moses is going back to Egypt to lead the people out of slavery, but he is not in compliance with the one command that God gave to Abraham, which is circumcision. So he's not signed on to the covenant people, and there's a lot of ambiguity about his identity in the opening chapters of Exodus. Is he a Hebrew? Is he an Egyptian? Is he a Midianite? Where does he belong? You can get a glimpse of this sense of hybrid identity or uncertainty when he has his first son and names him Gershom, which means foreigner there. And he says, I've become a foreigner in a foreign land. But it's not at all clear what he means by that. Does he mean he's become a foreigner in Midian? Or is he referring back to his time in Egypt, where he was growing up in this privileged position in the Egyptian palace, and then his identification with the suffering of the Hebrews makes him a foreigner in the palace? Like he doesn't belong there anymore, and he's not safe and has to flee. It's not clear where his identity is. That gets resolved at Mount Sinai when God appears to him in the burning bush and says, I'm the God of your father, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That resolves Moses' identity question. But Moses has not taken the next step to say, all right, I'm in. I'm all in. And he cannot lead the people where he hasn't been willing to go himself. So God has just said to Moses that he's supposed to tell Pharaoh, this is what Yahweh says, Israel is my firstborn son. And I told you, let my son go so he may worship me, but you refuse to let him go, so I will kill your firstborn son. So there's a pattern of fittingness or justice to this, where Pharaoh is withholding God's firstborn son, and so God is going to take aim at Pharaoh's firstborn son. And Moses still hasn't identified which camp he's in. Is he the son of Pharaoh, or is he the son of Yahweh? And so the circumcision resolves that. There's a lot of ambiguity in the Hebrew text of these three verses, 24 to 26. The ESV is a little bit more open-ended than the NIV, but still resolves some of the who the pronouns are referring to. So I think you read that she touched Moses' feet with the foreskin, but that's not what it says in Hebrew. It's she cut off his foreskin and touched his feet with it. And it's not clear whose feet is she touching, or even whether these are actual feet or if this is a euphemism for male private parts, which happens occasionally in the Bible. So given the nature of the surgery she just performed, I think it's possible that she is touching Moses' privates with the foreskin of their son as a way of not only circumcising their son, but kind of re-circumcising Moses, activating his circumcision as a covenant circumcision. We don't know whether he was circumcised as a Hebrew baby, if that's how the daughter of Pharaoh knows that he's a Hebrew, or if his circumcision was the Egyptian style of circumcision, which happens at puberty, not at birth, and which has nothing to do with the covenant with Abraham. There's questions about that, what she's actually doing, but I think it's possible that her action is meant to rectify whatever problem he has, being out of compliance. And so her statement, which I would translate, surely you have become a blood relative to me, not a bridegroom of blood, but a more generic relative by marriage. I think she's actually talking to Yahweh here, saying, okay, now we're in your covenant family and we weren't before. But it's ambiguous. So right. In any case, what's resolved by the end of the scene is that Moses is now compliant with the instructions to Abraham in Genesis about circumcision. So now he can lead the people. His identity has been solidified. And so now when he goes to the people and says, you all have to circumcise your sons and celebrate the Passover, and then I'll get you out of here, they wouldn't be like, well, how come you haven't done that?
Right.
Right. Yeah. It seems like, I mean, every time there is like an Exodus, there's always someone who goes through as a precursor. I haven't thought about that, though, that the bridegroom of blood, she may be speaking to Yahweh at that point. I'll have to think more on that. That's really interesting. Okay.
It's possible.
But yeah, I mean, still, that's cool that, I mean, this really confusing story is contributing to the overall narrative by having, putting our elect, but the chosen one to bring them through the Exodus, going through some Passover. So that's awesome. So I want to get your thoughts on something that I've been thinking about myself. And I know you've done some work on in a book that was in, I can't remember the name of it now.
This one.
That one. Yes. For us, but not to us, in honor of John Walton. But yeah, you did some work on showing how the Exodus and creation are so closely linked.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wanted to know how exactly you thought about the relationship between the creation and Exodus, because it does seem often these links, it almost seems as though creation and Exodus are nearly inseparable concepts, but they are used separately at times. There are Exoduses that are not creations in Genesis and vice versa, so on.
Yeah, I would argue that Exodus is a creation story, that it's the creation of the nation of Israel. And that's why it's told in Genesis-shaped ways. So we have all the echoes in chapter 1 about being fruitful and multiplying and filling the land. So that signals that we should have creation in mind as we read it. God institutes a seventh-day rest, Sabbath rest in the wilderness. That's an echo of day 7 of creation. When they get to the mountain and they are supposed to build the tabernacle, there's all sorts of resonances with the tabernacle that make it like a creation story. So I have a list here. God appears to Moses on the mountain. He goes up into the cloud, and for 6 days he waits, and on the 7th day God speaks and tells him about the tabernacle creation, which is so interesting because God spoke the first 6 days in Genesis 1 and then rests the 7th day. Now he's like, okay, now I have something that's 7th day-ish to do. And that thing is, I'm going to come dwell among you, which is really fabulous. No.
Well, it's kind of occurring to me that, just speaking to, we had Jeffrey Niehaus on a few months ago, and we were, just talking about how it's expected of the monarch in these different texts to give a law. And so perhaps, I mean, this is where Moses, he is the lawgiver and is kind of portrayed in a kingly manner. But if this is on the 7th day where Yahweh gives the law to Moses, if this is supposed to be, okay, he's taking up his rest, which means his enthronement, and so this is kind of his way of becoming king. I don't know, maybe I'm off track there, but it's just initial thoughts.
Yes, there are definitely some royal overtones. I would say it's not exalting Moses as king, but Yahweh as king, because Yahweh is the one who actually gives the law. There are people who try to argue that Moses is a king figure, but I think he's pretty consistently put forward as a mediator rather than a ruler. Although there is the comment in chapter 2, who made you ruler and judge over us? And then you're like, well, Yahweh's about to.
Right.
It hasn't happened yet, but that's coming. Yeah, I'm so glad you talked with Dr. Niehaus. He was my advisor for my master's thesis.
Cool.
So, and one of my seminary profs. So yeah, so many things, so many connections between the tabernacle and creation. We have the cherubim guarding the way to the tree of life, cherubim on the Ark of the Covenant. There's a tree of life in the garden, and we have this candelabra that's in the shape of a tree in the tabernacle. There's gold and onyx in the garden. There's gold and onyx stones in the tabernacle. The creation days were evening to morning, and there was evening and morning the first day, and there was evening and morning the second day. And similarly, the priests were supposed to keep the lamps lit from evening till morning. So it has that kind of evening morning pairing. It seems like the priestly garments, which give the priest dignity and honor, are a reversal of the shame of nakedness from the garden. There's a concern even that they wear underwear so that there's no nakedness. So that's interesting.
Right. We've talked about before on here about how the words that are used, there's 3 words for, I think, making and clothing them with these ketonet that are not used again together until Exodus 28, I want to say, where Aaron's clothed. And so just, others, I think,
yes.
I can't remember who pointed that out to me, but just, again, more links between high priestly garments and Adam and Eve.
Yes, that's great. And then we have Bezalel and Oholiab, who are skilled workers, endowed by the Spirit with these skills to actually make the stuff. And so we have the Spirit of God from Genesis 1 reappearing here. So many, the priestly ordination ceremony is 7 days long. There's 7 days of atonement on the altar, and they're supposed to keep doing this 7-day ceremony when Aaron's successors take his place. The tabernacle instructions happen on the 7th day of Moses waiting, and there are 7 speeches, and the last speech God makes is the speech about the Sabbath, which is a way of saying, even though you're building my house, I want you to rest on the 7th day. Like, this doesn't override the need for rhythms of work and rest. So it seems very intentional. And then the implementation of the tabernacle instructions happen in 3 speeches, and the first speech starts with the Sabbath again. So there's kind of Sabbath framing around the golden calf story, kind of making a sort of chiasm. It's 7 on one side and 3 on the other. It's so fascinating. And then when they finish the tabernacle, it uses the same word for finish, with God finished creation, and they finished the tabernacle and his presence filled it. So it seems clear to me that God is bringing his people out of chaos, out of the disorder of Egypt.
Tohu vavohu.
Yes, and into, you see the dismantling of Egypt in the what's traditionally called the 10 plagues, which I call the 12 signs and wonders. That's another topic. But we see the dismantling of order in Egypt and the bringing of God's people out and bringing about order for them, in contrast to the disorder of Egypt. So much fun.
Yeah, they're so closely linked, and that's why I've come to see that. Again, like you said, the Exodus is a creation story, and those two concepts, they can't be unbound, really. There are some, I think in Genesis, there are some places, and elsewhere as well, I'm sure, but there are places where the Exodus motif is recalled through some elements, such as, looking and seeing. That didn't happen in the actual Genesis 1 creation story, but it shows up elsewhere. So sometimes they're separated, but in reality, both in Genesis 1, in the Exodus, and in Revelation, the new
Seeing
creation
and
idea
taking.
and these ideas of Exodus and creation, they are the same thing, being brought from the ruin, Exodused out, and then made into a new creation.
Yeah. We even have the Exodus story prefigured in Genesis when Abraham and Sarah go down to Egypt. Sarah is taken in by Pharaoh. There's like plagues on Pharaoh's household, and then he sends her back and sends them away with wealth, and they come up out of Egypt with wealth. And it's like, whoa.
Right.
That reminds me of another story I've heard.
I like the next story, actually. I forget all the links in there, but there's notes of oppression words that are used on Lot when he gets taken off in Chedorlaomer's army, and then he gets brought out with all of his family and there's like a mixed multitude and great possessions motif that he comes out with. And that, for some reason, is sprinkled in about 15 times in the book of Genesis in just random places. And so it's very, very cool. Yeah, I was just curious to see your take on, like, do you see those as closely linked, or do you see some dissociation? But yeah, that's really good.
I think it's pretty tightly linked, and I would love to write a commentary on Genesis someday, because I feel like now that I've immersed myself in Exodus, I'll probably see all kinds of stuff in Genesis that anticipates what we're going to see in Exodus.
I would be excited for that if you did it.
A bunch of other projects lined up first, but we'll see.
So something else I wanted to ask you too was, because this is something that I'm not settled on yet, and you have made a case that has caused me to be a little more unsure and rethink it. So Sailhammer, for instance, he argues for, I think, Aaron being a concession to Moses because of his fear, and then also the Israelites, they were supposed to go up the mountain, and they, because of their fear, they did not, and so therefore they were given law instead of being able to come up into God's presence. And so the law was something that was not ingrained into the fabric of reality. It was more so a temporary consequence of the situation. And, we see it later in Paul, he says, yes, the law, it is something that was supposed to be temporary until essentially Messiah came. So I'm wondering because I do think you make a really compelling case for the fact that Israel did well. They passed the test by not going up the mountain. They weren't supposed to encroach on God's territory, and that Aaron, he was also already on his way to Moses whenever God was speaking to him. So maybe he wasn't a concession. It just so happened that Moses was, doubting God anyway.
Yes.
So I suppose with that, I wonder, do you see any way in the first couple of books that the law and the priestly cult would not have been the situation that happened that would not have come about. There would have been more of a faith of Abraham kind of relationship with Israel.
Yeah, I think you've already mentioned some of the key evidence that I would cite, and that is God has already selected Aaron to assist Moses before Moses even says he has an issue. It says, your brother Aaron is already on his way to meet you, which tells me God anticipated Moses' need for a partner. Now, Aaron's role in that series of scenes is not really a priestly role. It's more of a prophet role where he's being the mouthpiece. And so I suppose you could still make a case later that the priesthood is a concession. But I feel like this is setting the way chapter 3 and 4, I guess it's chapter 4, sets us up to understand Aaron, makes me think that he belongs in the story and he belongs in this role, especially in chapter 6 when Moses brings up the uncircumcised lips again. And then we have a genealogy kind of coming out of nowhere. And then the uncircumcised lips thing happens again after the genealogy. There's like a framing of the genealogy with the problem that it is solving. So who am I to do this? I can't really do this job. But look, here's the genealogy that identifies the tribe of Levi and specifically the family of Aaron to resolve this question. It's not a comprehensive genealogy. You would expect to see all 12 sons of Jacob listed and their descendants, but all you get is a running start with Reuben and Simeon, and then it's all Levi until the end. And if you map it out on paper, the tribe that gets the most attention is Levi, and the family of Aaron gets, I think, 6 generations mentioned, which is way longer than any of the other branches of the tribe of Levi. So this is, I think, telling us something about those responsible for passing along these stories to us and maintaining the tradition. I mean, it ends with Phinehas, who's not even born when the book of Exodus happens. He can't have been, because everyone from the Exodus generation dies before they go into the land, and yet Phinehas has a star role to play at the end of Numbers after the first generation's already dead. So he's not even born yet, and yet the genealogy is tipping its hat to him. I think this is telling us that God has a plan for Levi, and Aaron plays a role in that. And I would say the same about the law. You would have to start with a primarily negative view of the law in order to think of it as a sort of a concession that, like, well, I didn't want to have to do this, but now I have to give you the law. And I have a thoroughly positive view of the law that doesn't fit very well with that. I see again and again that the law demonstrates God's character. It shows his heart. It's not salvific. It was never salvific. God had already saved the people. He'd already rescued them from Egypt and redeemed them when he gave them the law. So the purpose is not to get people saved and then it's done away with later. Its purpose is to get them on mission as the people of God. Here's how they're to live out their vocation of as his representatives in the world. And I think you mentioned already that being a lawgiver is an important role for an ancient Near Eastern king. This is why we have Hammurabi's code made on a stela that's like put on public display, because Hammurabi needs everybody to know what a good king he is. Look at the wise jurisdiction of his realm. And so I think in that cultural context, it was important for Yahweh to say, here's what kind of king I am, by giving the law. And so I don't think it's a concession to some problem at Sinai. You could call it a concession to ancient Near Eastern culture or an accommodation to ancient Near Eastern culture, but I wouldn't quite call it a concession.
Yeah, I actually have that in my notes, because with God being the king, you would expect him in this culture to give a law. And,
yep. And so, to build a temple.
To build a temple, right.
Yeah.
And so it kind of has, from different authors that I've read who are big names in Old Testament theology, this kind of pitted against, the two ideas pitted against each other in my head of, okay, well, if Israel wasn't rebellious, some say that they could have lived by the faith of Abraham, which they would have lived out the law without actually having to be told what to do, versus you expect the law because of the literary convention and the cultural convention of what a king is and does. So yeah, no, I appreciate that input, because those have still been bouncing around in my head and I haven't fully settled, but that makes a lot of sense that, I mean, with Aaron already playing a significant role, and then there's this strangely priestly genealogy hanging out there in the first few chapters of Exodus.
Before we have priests, or know what to do with them.
Right. And we
Yeah.
just need to reorient ourselves around the fact that the law is not, this, like you said, oh, darn, I have to do it. I have to give you some more rules. But it also shows here's just some guidelines, some case studies to show here's how you maintain order in God's community.
Yeah. Yep. I think that's exactly right. And then we see it lived out. One of the mysteries that I don't feel like I've solved yet, I'm working in chapter 32 right now. And I don't understand how Aaron gets to stay as high priest after the golden calf incident. Like, this is baffling to me. Aaron is so clearly complicit in the idolatry of the Israelites. He uses a tool to shape the calf, and then he minimizes his role, saying it just popped out of the fire.
Right.
And I want to know, like, how come 3,000 Israelites had to die that day, but Aaron didn't have to? How come he gets to continue to serve in this role?
Yeah, especially with that being after the initial Sinai event. 'Cause I know
Yes.
there's consequences after that, but I mean, Ezekiel, like that's the exact thing that Yahweh left for.
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't understand that except I wonder if it's the grace of God in preserving that connection. Or is it because Aaron hasn't been ordained yet? Like, he hasn't been through the purification process yet. If this had happened after he was purified and ordained, then it would be a different story. Like, his sons get struck dead on the spot in Leviticus 9. So maybe, or 10.
Yeah.
So maybe Aaron would also would have been struck dead if the ordination had already happened.
Okay. This is going to bug me for a while, but
Yeah,
thank you
it's
for
bugging
that.
me. It's bugging me right now. So thanks for letting me air my current conundrum.
I'll be looking forward to see what you come up with on that. Okay, so yeah, since we're at Sinai, yeah, go ahead, Nate.
Yeah, it would be crazy for us to have you on our podcast and not ask you about your book, Bearing God's Name, and why that's such a significant matter when it comes to the book of Exodus. And so, yeah, what does it mean for the Israelites to bear God's name? Where does that come from? Why is it significant?
Yeah. So I'm using the phrase bearing God's name in the titles of my books. That's not usually how we think of the command not to take the Lord's name in vain. We usually think of taking or misusing. And so my doctoral dissertation, as I mentioned, was a deep dive studying that one verse, trying to figure out how can we read it well in its literary context, in its historical, cultural context, and in terms of the theological themes that it participates in. And I'm convinced we've mistranslated it and misunderstood it, that this is not about speaking God's name primarily, although it would include that. Like, I don't recommend people go around using Yahweh's name as a swear word. However, I don't think ancient Israelites were doing that, and that this is like trying to rein them in. Ancient Near Eastern people understood the power of divine names, and they treated them with great care. So in Hebrew, it says, you shall not bear or carry the name of Yahweh your God in vain. And if we look in the near context, we find that the high priest also bears or carries names. Caleb already mentioned chapter 28, verse 29. The high priest has 12 gemstones on his chest, each one engraved with the name of one of the 12 tribes. And it says, and so Aaron shall bear their names before me in this breastpiece as a remembrance. He also has onyx stones, one on each shoulder with 6 names on each. So these qualify him to be the representative of the people. It qualifies the people to have a share in his ministry when he's making sacrifices on behalf of the nation. They benefit from that because they're identified on his official clothing that he wears to do his job. He also has Yahweh's name on his forehead. It says holy belonging to Yahweh on his forehead on a gold medallion. And I think that we should be looking to him as a visual model of what's true of every Israelite. And I don't think this is a stretch. Sometimes there's a couple commentaries who say, well, the closest match we have for the language of the name command is in chapter 28, but that's a different thing and it's not relevant. And they just dismiss it out of hand. And I want to say, in chapter 19, God has the first thing he tells the people when they get to Sinai is that they are a kingdom of priests. So it makes total sense to me that we should be looking at the priesthood to find out about the vocation of the Israelites. They like the high priest, bear God's name. They bear it. It's invisible. It's like an invisible brand or tattoo that marks them as the people who belong to Yahweh, and they're supposed to be a holy nation, set apart as holy from the nations to represent him. That representative role is also signaled in chapter 19, verse 5, with the word segala in Hebrew. They are his treasured possession, which is not just a term of endearment. It's actually a technical term used in treaty context to indicate a treasured partner. It's like an ambassador. Israel is Yahweh's ambassador among the nations, his segala. So all of these things working together tell me that what we're seeing in the Ten Commandments is a command not to misrepresent Yahweh. You are the people who belong to me, so bear my name well, live by my commands. And once you see this, it's hard to unsee it. It's all through the Bible. Lots of passages that we recognize, like Psalm 23, he leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. What does his name have to do with how I live? Well, if I'm someone who bears God's name, then me walking in righteous paths or living rightly has a bearing on Yahweh's reputation and what others think of him. So I think the clearest sort of like the thing that seals the deal for me is in Numbers chapter 6, when Moses explains to Aaron the blessing that he is to pronounce over the Israelites. May Yahweh bless you and keep you. May Yahweh make his face shine on you and be gracious to you. That blessing is followed in verse 27 by the statement, and so he shall put my name on them and I will bless them. So there's this sense that in the ministry of Aaron the high priest and in the blessing he pronounces on them, they are being branded or stamped with Yahweh's name. And so now they carry it, and so they should carry it well.
Yeah, I love that. Your book is so helpful, and it really just brings forward I think one of the main themes, if not the main theme, of the entire Bible. At least our role in it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it heightens it so much more too, to like, it's not just about saying that one little thing. It's about, look, anytime you do something stupid, you're making God look stupid. That's significant. And so,
and we live this, right? We see the headlines in the news when a pastor falls in sin, is caught being abusive or something. It's not just like, oh, that one pastor is a bad dude. What lots of people conclude is that Christianity is full of hypocrites, that God sponsors violence against the vulnerable, whatever. So you end up getting this like major PR problem anytime a Christian who claims to belong to God lives in a way that's contrary to that.
whether we know it or not, we are representatives.
Exactly.
Yeah. So during you had a few videos out recently about a trip to Egypt that you took.
Yes.
And so you came back and just told a lot about the iconography that you saw in, well, just Egyptian iconography, and how you saw the same iconography and symbolism in the Bible.
Yeah.
And so how can understanding specifically Egyptian iconography or just cultural concepts, how can that help our understanding of the Bible, or specifically the book of Exodus? Yeah, how does this help our reading, especially of Israel's cult?
I've noticed that my students are a little uncomfortable with this topic when I start showing them Egyptian images and telling them, look, Egyptian temples are kind of like the tabernacle. They have garden imagery. Look, they have a starry night sky over their head, just like it would have been if you had the blue curtains of the tabernacle over your head with gold flecks in them, and the lights are shining, and it would look like a starry night sky. Or look, the Ark of the Covenant is a really fancy box on poles carried by priests, and it has a symbol of the deity on the top. So we've got cherubim. Look, here's an example from King Tut's tomb where he's got the god Anubis on top, and the priests would have carried it. And they're kind of like, I need the Bible to be really unique and different, and you're telling me it's just like the Egyptians? Like, why would God do that? Why wouldn't he do something entirely new? Why doesn't God just show up in a Tesla? And so I want to say, okay, God is not copying the Egyptians. God is communicating. He's a master communicator, and he's communicating in a cultural context in which worship has taken particular shape. It's mediated in certain ways. And so he's working within that framework of understanding and saying, hey, stop thinking about these other gods. Stop going to their temples. Come and worship me. And he uses enough of the symbolism of these other temples so that they know that what they're doing is worship, and that it's replacing that thing they saw in Egypt. So I think the similarities are meant to communicate clearly that God has defeated the gods of Egypt. I think there are also significant differences. We don't actually have an image of God. We have cherubim, and cherubim, even in Egyptian iconography, these winged creatures, they hold their wings around the cartouche of the pharaoh or the name of the deity or the image of the deity. They're not the deity. They're like the protective figures around the deity. And so it would have signaled, in the shape of the Ark of the Covenant, would have signaled, we don't have an idol that represents Yahweh. He's asked us not to do that. We have an empty space where we would expect an idol. And the reason, I think Tim Mackey says it really well in his Bible Project video on the image of God, God doesn't want an idol because we are his images. He's created us to represent him as his physical reminders of his presence and rule on earth. So he doesn't want a dead stone, metal, whatever statue to represent him. So there's lots of similarities. Even the shape of the tabernacle mimics the war tent of Ramses II. They're the same dimensions, the same proportions, with an outer courtyard and inner tent, with a third of that inner tent being a square throne room. And Pharaoh Ramses II was so proud of this tent and so proud of the Battle of Kadesh, which is when he used this war tent, that he decorated. It's the most highly advertised battle in all of he decorates like 4 different temples with scenes from that battle and the outline of his war tent. So no matter where you lived in Egypt, you would have been aware of this and aware of his claim to have single-handedly defeated his foes at the sea. And then you have God taking his people through the Sea of Reeds, defeating Pharaoh. If it's Pharaoh Ramses II, which I would suggest it probably was, he's actually beating Pharaoh at his own game. He's one-upping him. And then he's got this elaborate tabernacle that's built to replace Pharaoh's war tent. So I find that super fascinating.
Yeah, we've gone through multiple points just as we're going through, talking about different through Genesis creation stories, flood stories, the tale of two brothers, Akkad, things like that. And so, I like to use the example of, like, there are 100 different Cinderella stories in our culture, and none of them are the same. They all tweak little things to show us something new, teach us something new, and that's what's going on. So
yeah,
hopefully whoever's listening to this is very comfortable with that idea by this point. But I mean, that is so cool, just seeing. There's a few of those I've heard you mention before, and others there that were new to me. Just seeing how it's all taking their concepts and saying, Yahweh's on top of it and plus one.
Yes, totally.
All right. So one more thing about just how to read or handle some portions of the text is, I wanted to ask, we have people, going back to the 11th century, at least to my knowledge, talking about certain scenes in the book of Exodus being out of order, such as the Ten Commandments may have come after the golden calf chronologically rather than before, like it is in the story, at least something that Sailhammer and Rashi bring up. So it doesn't, not that example specifically, but there's other examples like that. So whenever we see, whenever we do some, source critical work and try to figure out what the original chronology of the events were, how should that affect our reading? Should it at all? Should we just focus on a literary reading, a historical reading?
Yeah.
What's your take on that?
Good question. So I'm not a source critic, and you don't have to know me very long to realize that. You're never going to hear me talking about JEDP. Not because I don't think there's any merit to the idea of sources, but because I find the whole enterprise to be so highly speculative and with so much disagreement that there doesn't seem to be a consensus. I find it much more interesting to look at the final literary design of the book, the form we have it in. But having said that, as I read it, there are times when it seems like the clues are there, that this is not quite in order. And I don't take that to be evidence of different sources that have been inexpertly combined, but rather the brilliance of the narrator who is moving something around to make a particular point. So one example that I'll mention is chapter 18, where Jethro visits Moses. It very carefully never mentions Sinai, because they don't arrive at Sinai until chapter 19. But it says in verse 5, Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, together with Moses' sons and wife, came to him in the wilderness where he was camped near the mountain of God. So he's near Sinai, hint, hint. And then they have this whole conversation. They report on what God did, and it's okay. So why put this here if where they are is the mountain of God? Essentially, they've arrived at Sinai. Why not put it later? I think it would interrupt a very important, like, prime focus on Yahweh speaking to the people when they arrive at Sinai. The arrival of Jethro would be an interruption in that sequence, and we would miss out on some of the framing that happens by having him right before Sinai. As I mentioned earlier, there's a bunch of literary links, like word links, between chapter 4 with the Zipporah story and its surrounding micro scenes and this chapter. So we have Jethro, we have Zipporah, we have the sons, we have meeting in the wilderness to kiss near the mountain. Like, there's all kinds of things that mimic each other from these two chapters. I think chapter 18 is functioning as the end of the rescue of Israel story. So it's kind of like parentheses or bookends or frames with chapter 4, which was the pivot between the rescue of Moses to the rescue of Israel. So then we have that resolved. The Jethro-Zipporah question is resolved before we turn our attention to Yahweh at Sinai. It also accomplishes a even greater literary design feature that I find really fascinating. I didn't bring it with me, but I just got in the mail 2 days ago my copy of the Cambridge Companion to Biblical Narrative. I contributed a chapter on reading the wilderness narratives, and I have a chiasm in there that I have discovered that I haven't seen anywhere else. People have mentioned the kind of framing effect that on either side of the Sinai narratives, which run from Exodus 19 all the way to Numbers 10, on either side of that, you have a whole bunch of things that mirror each other, like the angel of Yahweh, the gift of manna and quail, a battle against the Amalekites, etc. But what I hadn't seen anyone actually uncover is the fact that they are in order. It's this giant literary sandwich on either side of the Sinai narratives. And check it out. If you go to Numbers chapter 10, which is where they are taking off from Sinai, what is one of the first things that happens? They leave Sinai. They're leaving in a particular order. And verse 29, chapter 10, verse 21, 9. Now Moses said to Hobab, son of Reuel the Midianite, Moses' father-in-law. So we've got a mention of a Midianite family member, male family member. We're setting out for the place about which Yahweh said, I will give it to you. Come with us and we will treat you well, for Yahweh has promised good things to Israel. So there's a conversation with the Midianite about joining in with the people of Israel, exactly on either side of Sinai. So that begins this chiastic structure that kind of has ripple effects going out through Numbers and back through the wilderness narratives of Exodus. So that is, I think that's why chapter 18 is out of chronological order, because it's functioning in important structural ways that we would miss if it interrupted God at Sinai.
So when we see things like that, we should be probably asking the question, not how did this actually historically happen, but why was it crafted this way?
Yes. Why tell this story here? What's it doing here?
Yeah, that's awesome. I'm going to have to take a look at the details in that. So that was the Cambridge
Companion to Biblical Narrative.
I'll have to look that up. Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so last thing I wanted to ask you just about the book of Exodus is you've done obviously a fair amount of work on the book of Exodus at this point. And so have there been any particular sections or themes that have been particularly insightful or formative for you think might be helpful for other people?
How many hours do you have? I mean, I love the whole book. And every time I come to a section that I think, oh, this part might be a little bit boring, it turns out to be really not boring. I would say I didn't really know what to do with the 10 plagues before I started studying them. And the amount of literary design and patterning that I discovered there was really insightful in what it showed me about the character of God. Right now, I've been living in the Covenant Scroll, chapters 21 to 24 or 23. And because that's where I'm releasing videos on my YouTube channel, I'm noticing how controversial and like these are hotly contested passages that often turn people off to the God of the Bible and the Christian faith. And I feel like again and again, as I read these things in context, I come away going, wow, Look at the way God looks out for the vulnerable. Look at the way indentured servants have the same value as free people. Look at the way children are valued as much as adults. Look at the way women are valued as much as men. And those are actually the opposite impressions lots of people have about the God of the Old Testament and the Old Testament narratives. So I hope people will take the time to watch the Torah Tuesday videos through the law, especially if they're feeling like they don't know what to do with the God of the Old Testament, because I'm trying to slowly build a case for how to read it in its historical, cultural context that helps us to see what's actually going on. And I find it super inspiring. It builds my faith. And I hope that others will find that too.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, the law is a good thing, and
Yeah.
I know I'm
Yeah.
still I'm a couple episodes behind on Torah Tuesday. I'm just to the point we're about to talk about the law, but I've heard you talk about some of the way that they function as case law and how it reveals a different meaning than what may be on the surface of some of our translations.
Yeah.
So I just highly recommend anyone confused about the laws go check out the videos that she's doing. Take a look at her work on the law, because it's the law is good. We read it often as oppressive, but it's
Yeah.
really not.
And people who've read Bearing God's Name have often asked, okay, so, but like, tell me, like, what do I do with the individual laws? Like, you've talked about one, really, and maybe I give like one other example, but like, what about all the rest? And so
Right.
the YouTube series is doing all the rest. Like, we're going law by law and saying, what's the relevance of this? Today, I just recorded one this morning about pit bulls and goring oxen, and the relationship between
It's good.
modern issues in our neighborhoods and ancient issues. And I think there's a lot of wisdom here that we could share with our neighbors.
Yeah, I know Nate and I have talked about before, putting some notes together that we have on all the laws, just doing like a 60-second little snippet of, what's the meaning of this law in its culture. I've wanted to do that, but I also remember hearing comments from, actually, you made a comment like this one time on a video about how the doing those short little snippets, you can't back anything up, and so it's hard to do them. So
The amount of hate and vitriol that I have encountered in the past 2 months has outweighed anything I've seen in 10 years of public-facing work. It's been crazy. It's been crazy how many times I've been called a liar, disingenuous, ignoramus. I mean, because people have these ways of thinking about the God of the Bible, and I'm coming at it more slowly from a different angle and trying to slowly build my case. And then if you have like just a 60-second clip that goes out, they don't get all that slow building foundation. And so then they're like, what do you think you do? You should read the Bible for a change. And I'm like, actually, I do.
Yeah.
In Hebrew.
And I'm reading what the guys who wrote the Bible were probably reading also, so that helps. Yeah.
Right.
But
anyway,
it's so important to. I like what you're doing, trying to break down these laws so slowly and help people understand them in our culture, so that we read them how they're meant to be read. So that's
it's been
great.
a blessing to me, so I hope it's a help to others as well.
I'm sure it will be. We appreciate your work, and we know you're not a liar or crazy, and you actually do read your Bible. So
I might be wrong, but I'm not lying intentionally about anything.
Right. Well, no, it's all been good stuff. So we really appreciate you coming on and giving us an overview of Exodus, answering some of our questions. We wish we could, like you said, hours and hours. We have lots to talk about in the book of Exodus, but thanks so much for coming on and giving us a bit of your time to help us transition from Genesis into Exodus, and hopefully people have come to find your videos and your work next. So just real quick, if you're listening, definitely check out Bearing God's Name, Being God's Image. Keep a lookout for Becoming God's Family. And is there a tentative date for that?
October 28th is the release date. So it's still a ways off, but it's coming.
Okay. And then what was remind me the name of your Bearing God's Name dissertation?
Bearing Yahweh's Name at Sinai, a re-examination of the name command of the Decalogue.
Awesome.
So it's published by Penn State University Press.
Awesome. And then when can we expect that commentary?
My big goal, like this would be like, wow, is to get it done by the end of 2025. And then it would take at least a full year, probably a little more than a year for them to process it and typeset it and all of that. So we're looking at for sure 2026, maybe later, depending on how quickly I can get through the tabernacle.
Well, that's not too far away. So we'll keep a lookout for that, and we'll put out a reminder when it comes out. Absolutely.
Cool.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming on, and this has been super helpful and fun, and makes me want to go back and study Exodus again.
Preaching of the sermon series.
Yeah,
Yes.
there you go.
Yeah. Let's do this
I'm
again.
sure, I'm sure Mercy Hill would love that.
Well, thank you guys for having me on. Appreciate
Thank
it.
you.
Thank you.